Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to my HashiTalk session. I'm going to be speaking about orchestrating change around people, process, and technology. My name is Ryler Hockenberry, and I work at Mastercard. So jumping right into it, what I want to start with is the relationship between people, process, and technology. And intuitively, we understand that there's a tight coupling between these three components. If we try to move one without moving the other two, it can put a change at risk or introduce blockers to that change. For example, if we're bringing a new tool or technology into the technology stack, we're going to have to adapt people. They're going to have to learn new skills and abilities, and that might be done through trainings and courses. Likewise, process will also need to adapt. So we may need to make changes to the way we do on call so that we can better adapt to the technology and accommodate the new tooling. Now, when we talk about orchestrating change, we need to think about very strategically moving these three components together. If one component is out of balance, if it doesn't shift, it can compromise change in the other two. And on the flip side of that, if we really want to accelerate our technology, we can invest more heavily in people and process. Quite often we think about these interdependencies between technology and people and technology and process last at the end of a project. And so we need to come into the mindset of thinking about people and process first and seeing how those fit into technology. So my goal today is to talk about technology change and to share tips about how to make technology change more effective by capitalizing on moving people and process together with technology. So very quickly, this is what I plan to get into. I'm going to start with discussing technology change. Then we'll talk about people change, then process change. So we'll hit all three of those components that are part of the PPT framework. And then as we start to wrap up, I'm going to be talking about some case studies about how at Mastercard Data and Services, we came to adapt Terraform and we came to adapt Vault. And by looking at these case studies, it's going to sort of weave together all these different change components that are part of this framework that I just introduced. So technology change, internal tool changes, deprecation of old systems, onboarding new tools, revamping interface. Those are all types of technology change that we see every day in our careers. And going into a new tech project, there's oftentimes a false assumption, a misconception that can sometimes steal value from our technology investments. And that assumption is that if we build something, everybody's going to want to use it. If we're excited about it, everyone else will be excited about it. If we build it today, people want to use it tomorrow. They'll know how to use it effectively. They know how to use it productively. They'll use it without any issues. And none of those things are ever true. And if it's not adapted and it's not used, then it's not delivering any value back to our organization. And even if your company is very innovative, if it's using the latest cutting edge tools, there are still elements of passive change resistance that you can face. So if we're looking at overall alignment of the organization, the human capacity resources to put those changes into effect, if we look at alignment with urgency or just slow development cycles by some teams versus other teams, if we look at past success and failures with change projects, those can all play a role into sort of the culture and the resistance of technology change. So we need to be very strategic about how we go about managing this resistance. People will view some changes as if they have a lot of resistance. Teams may have a non-zero effort that they put forth as other teams introduce changes. And the current state just has a lot of holding power. Change can create uncertainty and worry. And so resistance is always going to be expected. Resistance to change is the norm. It's not the exception. And so the question is, will we have resistance to a particular change? The question is, how much resistance will we have And how do we handle that resistance? And a lot of the answer to that lies in people and process, and dedicating and investing in those as we move technology forward at our companies. So we need to be mindful of the overall dynamics of our organizations and our teams. There's always a limiting capacity for every organization to absorb change. You don't want to make change too quickly. And overall, as we make those changes, we want to mitigate risk. So we need to understand the level of change that our teams or organizations are comfortable with. On one hand, we have this bucket of change called radical change. And these are changes that may go against or may not be aligned with the typical way of thinking at your organizations. So you might be calling into question some of the historical patterns or trends or norms that you have historically used to produce value at your organizations. For example, if you're at a company that's running a large fleet of Windows Server VMs for most of your infrastructure, then switching to Linux infrastructure would be an example of radical change. Another change that's going on throughout industry is shifting from a VM deployment model to a container-based deployment model. And in many cases, this is a radical change because it's requiring a mindset change. You're departing from these older patterns, and a whole lot of new process needs to come about to manage that change in how we think about these things. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have incremental change. And incremental change is focused on small everyday improvements. Think about this as toil, business as usual, all the stuff that goes into operating our technology stack and the small improvements that go right along with that. And it is a good amount of this is about perception. So what one team views as radical, other teams may view as incremental. So keep that in mind as you think about how your organization is positioned within this table. Now, overall, we want to reduce risk. So we can think about shifting some of the radical aspects into incremental aspects. So we can use tools like just making the change over a longer period of time, introducing intermediate steps along the way. That will make the change feel more comfortable to a lot of people. We can introduce the change in a more granular basis. So segmenting per team or per person, all of these can come together to help navigate the change for individuals. We can also try to affect how our organization overall comes together to be receptive to change. So if there's a shared long-term vision for the technology stack, it gets people excited about the end state. If team members feel like they can openly collaborate and sort of drive the bigger picture forward, people are more willing to make change. And if we're working on our culture with inclusiveness and diversity and no blame, that can open up opportunity for people to want to move forward together on technology change. So there's many things we can do overall to reduce risk, make things more approachable for your organization and for your teams. But no matter sort of like which level of risk we're working with, we still need to think about change management. So it's a question of more change management or less change management. And the way to think about approaching something that needs more change management is to invest more in people and process. So let's get started talking about people and people change. So there's ways of modeling people change. One of them is called the ADKAR model. We all navigate change a little differently. We all go through a set of common steps. So ADKAR is an acronym for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. And while people will move through all these stages in order, they may spend a different amount of time in each stage. So just very quickly, awareness is about understanding the change, knowing why the change is necessary. Are you buying into the change? Desire is about your willingness and support to believe in the change. Knowledge is about developing and having the right skill sets to apply that change. Ability brings together your desire and your knowledge. So if you have the right skills and you have the right attitude, you want to move this change forward, that all folds into your ability to help direct the change in the right direction. And then finally, reinforcement is this last piece about keeping the change sustainable. This ties into incentives and making sure that what you're doing is the right direction for your organization. Of course, we just don't think about change as an individual because we all work in teams and companies. So we need to think about change as a team. So right here, I have a group of 6 individuals who are all in the same team, and they're all going through some sort of change within the organization, whether that's a technology change or process change. They all sort of move through these ADKAR stages. So let's take a look let's take a look at this and see how we can sort of shuffle things around to make this a more efficient change for people. So the first thing you'll notice is that not everybody starts the change at the same time. So, person D is starting his awareness stage much later than, say, person A. And so one of the first things we can do is make sure we're delivering the right tone and the right message about change as soon as possible to the most people. And this seems sort of simple, but when we're working in the world of remote teams and global teams, it creates a more interesting dynamic where it's not so easy just to propagate the right message in the right place all the time. We need to make sure we're sharing the full picture and sharing the reasons behind the change and encouraging open dialogue. See if they have questions about bringing their overall awareness and starting them to think about this change and buying into the change. So person D, was the last one to sort of come into this awareness stage. And as a result of that, he's one of the last ones to finish out with the reinforcement stage. And so overall, the team change profile was extended because of that. Now we can also target some of the slower stages at the individual level. And so if we look at what's slowing people down from this change, we can target people individually and try to adjust for that. So if person E is having trouble building awareness, maybe we need to do more one-on-one discussions to sort of reinforce the motivation behind the change. If person C is having trouble with visibility, maybe we need better guidance or documentation or just maybe shadowing opportunities for him to build confidence in his ability. Maybe with person A and person F who are dealing with knowledge, maybe they have skills in the wrong area and they need some push or some dedicated time to just focus on the right skills and learning as much as they can. So by starting a change with the whole team at the same time and targeting individuals that have slower changes in specific areas, we can achieve an overall better profile for the amount of time it takes for the team to adopt the change. And so bringing these things together, we start to think about like compressing all those boxes down to see change happen a lot more rapidly. And of course, as you move across business functions, as you deal with like system administrators versus product developers versus DevOps engineers, they're all going to move at different rates, different velocities. And so it's a much more diverse picture as we look across our organizations for change, but it sort of follows the same general pattern. All right, one of the key pieces of ADKAR is desire. It can be really tricky to motivate people, have people buy in to a change that you want to push. And so engineers, can sometimes be passionate about tools and architecture and patterns. And so building support and influence and alignment is all really key to facilitate a change. Group dynamics are often not like super easy to approach, but one way that can help you sort of work through some of influence is by sort of mapping out the networks within your organization and who influences who. So let's look at an example here. So when you're pushing for a change, there's this idea of a winning network. So this is the core group that if you get buy-in with this group, most people would align with that group and you'll have a set of larger buy-in. So this buy-in, this winning network could be your manager. It could be maybe senior engineers on your team, maybe just one really, really well-respected engineer within your product area. It's not necessarily somebody with formal authority, but it's people who have a strong influence on others. So you want to reach out to these people. For example, Martha and Joe, maybe they're team leads within your organization, and you want to see where they stand. In this case, they're both neutral on whether a particular change should be moved forward. But then you also want to understand how to influence them. What are the networks that Martha and Joe lean on to help make decisions? And so if we extend this a little further, what we see is that Martha has a set of individuals maybe within her team that she leans on. Joe also has a set of individuals that heavily influence him. And so we want to get an idea of people who share the same vision as Martha and Joe, people who have pushed for similar changes as what we're trying to drive forward today. Maybe those people are pushed for similar things in the past or worked quietly sort of on that same change at a smaller scale. So David and Emily are gonna influence Martha. Sophia, Tim, and Mark are gonna influence Joe. But we potentially see a problem in that we're seeing some opposition that could potentially trickle on up into Joe. And Joe's part of our winning network, so we really need him to buy into this overall change. Of course, healthy opposition is never a problem. Debating and discussion is healthy, but the risk comes in when we end up pushing off a change because no one's able to come together and make a decision and agree. And that part of opposition is unhealthy. If we want to move things forward, we all eventually need to drive some alignment and agree to move forward in some area. So we can go ahead and identify this blocking network. This is an influence of individuals who might drive opposition to the change overall. And we're going to start to be strategic about how we approach this, thinking about our influence strategy. How should we go about, thinking about, should we target Martha and Joe? Should we try to convince Tim and Mark of the change and the benefits of the change? And so maybe we want to start with Tim and Mark and try to do some consulting, some active listening, asking questions, trying to get their perspective, maybe framing the conversation a bit better. So crafting what you're thinking to better resonate with a particular person's ethos and pathos. Maybe we do some form of choice shaping, where we try to sort of move away from the idea that this decision is a zero-sum game. All those things can be really beneficial and will help you work towards getting alignment to drive that desire to move a change forward. Okay, so let's get into process change super quickly. So processes are always heavily coupled with technology. They're effectively the bridge between people and technology, and they help sort of orchestrate the whole PPT framework. And what I want to sort of stress here is that as we move process forward and as we move technology forward, we want to make sure that we're doing that strategically. So I think iteration is a good approach there. Moving too fast can sort of cause problems with the overall rate of change of your organization. If your organization is not super receptive to change, you're going to have problems when you try to move too fast. It's also difficult to move process without moving technology because they sort of bridge everything together. So I think the first step to thinking about process refinement is thinking about scoring processes. This is maybe a little bit odd, but we want a way to track how we're improving the process over time to make sure that we are improving the process over time. So we can evaluate things like the productivity, the timeliness, the quality, the reliability of that process, just to make sure that we have a starting point in iteration one. We want to know where we are starting with that process and what are the weak areas so that we can come in and start to improve those. And then what we'll do is we'll look for those low scores for the process, and we'll try to extract those, think about those, brainstorm with your team about some of the common issues that are causing that issue. So if we have a low reliability score of 2, we can dig into that process and say, maybe we're having issues with handoff between teams. Maybe the first team the first part of the process is owned by one team, and that team is just feels the process is very important and gets it done quickly. And then there's a handoff to team B that handles the second half of the process, and they don't realize how important that process might be. And so maybe that's slowing down and causing issues with reliability. And we can start to iterate on that. So we can look at the sender and receiver interface. How does the process get handed off? We can look at some of the alignment and tone and influence, some of the stuff we talked about when we talked about people change. And so we can sort of work on this, iterate on it, and bring these changes back into a process, implement the process, run the process again, and then rescore the process. And so we're working through this iteration of improving one component at a time and trying not to change too much at once. So as we work through that, as we rescore the process, we can go ahead and iterate on it again. This time we see that reliability has been bumped up, so maybe we want to focus on quality. And maybe the issue here is with insufficient capacity. We don't have enough people on our team to get this process done. at the right quality. Or maybe it's because the documentation around the process is just ambiguous, or the results or the conclusion or the output of this process is just not defined the way it should be. So we can bring those things in, and maybe these things are technology problems. Maybe if we think about doing something with a Slack bot to automate a few things or push out a few reminders, it would help move the process along, maybe increase the quality, make the steps more clear if they're being given to you in a more immediate fashion. So we can try to look at it from a technology perspective and drive these things forward with a few technology changes and try to bump up our quality. And we can move through this process, iterating between technology iteration and people iteration to sort of drive our processes forward and be really productive and have a healthy alignment with how we like to move change forward just based on processes. All right, I'm going to be getting into the case studies now. This first case study is about adapting Terraform at Mastercard Data and Services. So the beginning state of this is that we had worked with our operations team to set up a process. So the process was that every time we want a VM change to be made, we would have to file a change management ticket in Jira describing the infrastructure modifications. And then somebody from the operations team would triage that issue, approve it, do a little bit of a security view, verify the requirements, and then schedule the ticket for somebody on the ops team to handle. And the ops team member would eventually pick up the ticket, they would check the requirements, they would work through provisioning it, either manually sometimes or using PowerShell would allow them to set the VM up. And then there was some iteration between that ops team member and the application team member. We had a way of iterating on that through different feedback channels, and it was a bit messy. So sometimes it was through a Slack communication, sometimes it was through a comment on a Jira ticket, and so that took more time. And so overall, with this initial process, we were looking at about a week just to get a VM up and running. So we started looking at how we can improve this. We have a process map. We see there are pain points. And so what we looked at next was how we can start to leverage Terraform. And as we had spun up our first Azure data center, we were looking for new tools and techniques to do things a little bit faster. And we chose Terraform, and then we used our Terraform to describe all of our infrastructure as we spun up the Azure data center. From there, we sort of got excited about the momentum that drove, and we brought it back to our on-premise data centers using the vSphere Terraform provider to move everything into Terraform for the on-premise data centers. And we can see the change to the process map once we did that. So we have the app team working directly with HCL to describe this change instead of filing a ticket to describe this change. We still have the ops team sort of in the loop to make sure we're verifying the requirements in the right way, make sure we have capacity to spin up this VM. But overall, we're seeing some pretty good reductions in the time it takes to provision a VM. And now the app team engineer can work through provisioning the infrastructure. They can do that manually right now with Terraform and sort of verify the infrastructure once it gets spun up. But we were really excited about this. So we have empowered individuals throughout our app team to basically own their own infrastructure. They had the tools to create infrastructure themselves instead of going through a process with the ops teams. And we saw this new model of distributed ownership of infrastructure. And now we could provision infrastructure faster. But we weren't quite done yet. This all sparked an interest in seeing how fast we can provision infrastructure. And so we worked with tools like code owners, which helps us distribute who's responsible for reviewing which changes as we file those PRs to make infrastructure changes. We worked with tools like Atlantis and brought in Atlantis to help automate a GitOps style workflow to provision VMs even quicker. And so that drove changes back into our process. We now have the app team engineer just interfacing with Bitbucket to make infrastructure changes. So they're opening a PR to get to describe the new VM in HCL. They're iterating on feedback from that pull request. And then when they go to merge that pull request, Atlantis helps us automatically apply those changes. So the developers no longer manually applying those changes. It's all automated. And so with this chain of adoption of these tools, we're just adding more and more value as we go along, and they're nicely building off of each other. So we went from this process where we had a lot of like messy communication, a lot of different groups interacting, a lot of iteration, to a streamlined process where there's less parties and we're just moving very fast overall. So now we can provision a new infrastructure and make an infrastructure change in under an hour in most cases, and that's with peer reviews, that's with auditability, that's with the ability to revert the change. So tools like Terraform have started us down on this path where we're constantly iterating on our process and our people, bringing those together to sort of revamp how we're thinking about some more core foundational services. The next case study has to do with Volt and how we adapted Volt at Mastercard Data and Services. So this started out probably as most new things start out at a company, proof of concept, looking at early iteration, doing some due diligence, some investigation, and then slowly moving that into a dev environment. And we figured out all the right technical details. We had auto unsealing working with Azure Key Vault. We had Key Vault ID working to load balance with Volt servers. And everything felt good. We felt confident in our ability to run Volt and operate it in any of our data centers. And so the question comes up, should we deploy Volt, which we feel very confident in, out to all of our production data centers? And the answer to that, which might surprise you, is no. We came to the conclusion, no, we should not, at least not yet. So the value of Volt being in production is dependent on people using Volt. And just because we can deploy it everywhere doesn't mean we should. It takes time and energy to operate it. And we just didn't have the justification yet to really extract the value from having Volt deployed everywhere. It doesn't do any good if a system is deployed that nobody really ever uses. So if we look back at the ad card model, we talked about influencing people. We need to focus on awareness, desire, and bring those changes about before we just set up Volt everywhere. So we needed to focus on developing use cases. So looking at the Volt operator in Kubernetes, establishing those good use cases where our application developers have an easy way to inject secrets in the pods. We explored some of the PKI management capabilities and started using client certificates to authenticate to some of our different infrastructure segments. And we wrote a proposal around that and shared it and gathered alignment. We looked at one of our major vaulting solutions at the time, Chef Vault, and started looking at what's our pathway to migrate from Chef Vault to the KV secret engine with HashiCorp Vault, and how do we get there? What's our long-term strategy? And so we held an investigation to look at that. So in doing all of this, we explored and marketed the capabilities that we could easily capitalize on and get a lot of value out of. It was about generating interest across our organization and generating support rather than just pushing something out into production. And with that, we could move into production more easily. We had the support, we had the efficiency, we had the momentum, and we could move something into prod and get value out of having something on prod as soon as we roll it out because of that. So it's not always about getting there the fastest if that doesn't produce value. It's about taking your time to make sure you're getting the right value out of the right tools. So I'm going to wrap things up with the same diagram that I started with, this PPT framework, but let's look at this slightly differently. As an organization becomes very good at shifting people and process and technology, they develop what's called change competency, just being very good at driving forward change. And as you start to look at these people, process, and technology components and start to tie and weave them together, start to unify them, you can just have a whole new set of tools where you need to dial in, process efficiencies or dial in more desire for people to get involved. So next time you're thinking about a technology solution or adapting a new tool or looking at implementing a change in architecture, focus on not just the technology, but the people and process that will help drive that technology forward. And the closer that we weave people, process, and technology, the faster that your team and organization can move. It will make it more agile and you can adopt more quickly. And when you get really good at making all these changes happen, you build even more momentum for even more changes. Thank you.